Here to talk about his book, The Last Myth, What the Rise of Apocalyptic Thinking Tells Us About America, is author Mathew Gross. He co-wrote the book with Mel Gillis. Mathew, it's really great to talk to you. Today is actually a day that has some significance. It's May 21st, and last year we interviewed Allison Warden from the We Can Know Project, and she was kind of one of the mouthpieces for the Herald camping, May 21st, 2011 is the end of the world. Now, of course, unless we're living in a fantasy world now, the world didn't end last May 21st. We haven't been able to get any comment from Allison on this since then, but it brings up an interesting broader point which you address in the book, which is what is the source and fascination with end of the world and apocalyptic thinking, and what is the history of it also? How far back does it go, and are we seeing more of a prevalence now? So pick a place to start. I know I threw a bunch of questions out there. How should we start thinking about this?
Well, I think it's interesting to think, if we think about the history and where this idea of the apocalypse came from and why it's so appealing to us, I think we can kind of arrive at a point where we start to understand what happened last May 21st and also what's happening to perhaps even a larger degree with the upcoming December 21st and some expectations that that might mark the end of the world or the beginning of a radical new era. So, to think about it, where does the idea of the apocalypse come from? Well, it's an idea that's approximately 2,500 years old, and it really comes to us from the political history of the Jews and the experience that they had in Israel and then in Babylon, kind of being buffeted by these major empires that swept to and fro. And over a period of time, the Jewish people came to understand that history was meaningful, that history was the place where God would unfold his plan for people. And in that experience, this idea that maybe an escape from history was needed. And that's really the central idea at the core of the apocalypse.
Okay, so we see, of course, a lot of religious-based end-of-the-world theory. You alluded to the supposed Mayan calendar, December 21st, 2012, end-of-the-world theory.
Yes.
There is also a secular side to apocalyptic thinking. Tell us a little bit about where that comes from.
Well, the idea of progress, of secular progress, really kind of originated obviously during the Enlightenment, and which kind of came out of the Reformation, which was a period that was preceded by a lot of apocalyptic anticipation. Martin Luther, decried Pope Leo as the Antichrist, and there was a lot of apocalyptic rhetoric at that time. And a lot of bloodshed came out of the Reformation, which a lot of people don't remember, but there was a lot of bloodshed in Germany following the Reformation. This idea of progress really started to emerge as an alternative to an apocalyptic end to the age. Instead, people began to believe that we could, through science and reason, really create a more perfect world on Earth, and to a certain degree, we didn't need God to do so. But that idea of progress, of material progress through history, really started to come undone at the beginning of the 20th century with the First World War, and that undoing really accelerated with the detonation of the first atomic bomb in 1945. And really from that period, from 1945 onwards, you begin to see this secular rise in secular apocalyptic thinking. And, that's accelerated as we've learned that many of the promises of science and technology that we thought would bring us a better life are in many ways threatening our lives and threatening the way we see and live in the world.
So when you mention that, what are you talking about? Are you talking about what some would argue? Well, I'll just open it. What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, the nuclear bomb is one obvious example, and we had periods of intense fear of nuclear exchange in the 1950s and through the 1980s. One could say it's receded a bit. But now we've seen how the age of oil and the use of carbon fuels has threatened the world as well through climate change. And we've also seen how the growth in the ability to grow more food through technology and carbon fuel inputs has produced a problem of overpopulation and resource depletion.
It's fascinating because we actually see, there's such a difference in the origins of someone like when Allison Warden was on the show and she was telling me this is going to be the place at which, last May 21st, where God decides who is good enough to live an eternal afterlife and who is going to be sucked into the planet, the depths of the planet, and punished in hell for all of eternity, compared to kind of what may appear to rational thinkers as, well, we may be approaching we may be hurting the possibility of staying on this planet indefinitely because of all of the reasons you listed. It's two such different places to start from, but it still ends up with a tendency among humans to think about the end of the world. What does that tell us, that you can start at such different places but end up with the same concerns?
Well, I think what it tells us is that the apocalypse, in many ways, we often fear it, but in many ways, it's a comforting idea. It's the notion that the world will end soon, and therefore, to a certain degree, I'm absolved of responsibility. If we kind of think of climate change as, well, a collapse is going to come as a result of it, it really changes our relation to it, because to a certain degree we do become powerless, but we also think, well, it's inevitable, and therefore we don't need to make the small changes like changing our light bulbs or reducing our energy consumption to possibly avert global climate change and its effects.
Well, the difference I find, though, is, and I'd be curious to get your thought of it since you've studied this in much more detail, on the side that seems more concerned about taking care of the planet and resources and climate change, there seems to be a much more kind of forward-thinking, positive attitude where, as far as let's fix this, let's make sure that the planet will be here for us. Whereas on the Allison Warden, Harold Camping, end of the world religious side, it seems to be more of a God is angry type of thing, and there is going to be punishment, there is going to be revenge, and so it really is very different, isn't it?
It is different, but there are similarities, because I do think to a certain degree when we talk about climate change, very often we find ourselves embracing that kind of apocalyptic dialectic and thinking about how, for example, well, eventually climate change will become apparent to everybody, and everybody will understand the way the world is and that this is real and we need to understand it. And that's not so different from the belief that the sky will break open and Christ will appear in the sky, and everybody, believer and non-believer alike, will understand that this is the way the world is. So yes, there's certainly, I think, on the left and among secular people, a relationship between the idea of an apocalyptic end and the desire to avoid that apocalyptic end through progress. But there are a lot of similarities, and one of the things that we argue in The Last Myth in our book is that the more we can understand how we fall back upon this apocalyptic idea, the more likely we are to move beyond it and find those solutions and implement them.
All right, the book is The Last Myth, What the Rise of Apocalyptic Thinking Tells Us About America. Mathew Gross, Mel Gillis are the authors. Really a pleasure to speak with you, Mathew.
Thank you so much for having us.